Hello, everybody. You are listening to Through Time and Clades, and my name is Albert.
And I'm Joan.
Yay! And today we are coming back to Dinosaurs: The Second Chapter, our series looking at the evolution of modern type birds. Um, but before we begin, I know you just came back from a huge trip, which you've been telling us about for the past few weeks. How are you feeling now?
I'm doing all right. I'm definitely in the vacation after the vacation mode.
Yeah.
Um, but no, it was good. We spent the last couple of days just kind of pacing ourselves and driving home. Before we left Florida, I was able to fortunately go back to the Florida Museum of Natural History again for a little bit. We had stopped and got in a hotel in Gainesville, and Mom had never been. She didn't go when I went with Gabs, so we planned that all out and we spent a couple hours there, and I could tell she really enjoyed it. The only difference being that it was raining fairly badly while we were there, thunderstorms because there was a huge tropical storm that was passing through.
Mm.
We were getting the remnants of that, so we couldn't do the butterfly rainforest like we wanted, but
Oh.
we still were able to go in and look at all the other exhibits, which are definitely great a second time around. I like it when there's a museum you can go to where there's just so many things that you find new things the second time around
Right,
that
right.
you had missed, um, and which is kind of fun. There's a whole room that's a recreation of the upland environments in Florida. So like where it gets a little bit more mountainous in the state, which is kind of funny to think about because you think that Florida is all flatland. It's like
Yeah.
nope, there's hilly areas there in the middle. um, and it's one of those exhibits where you have to look around and you just have to find animals all over the place. And I
Wow.
completely missed that there was a sleeping bobcat on a log. It was so camouflaged into it, and I was like, "Oh my god, there's a whole cat there!" And I missed that the last time.
That's
My
wonderful.
sister would have loved to have seen that. Um, yeah, it was just really really great again. But no, I definitely I'm glad to be home. I'm glad to be kind of back in a normal environment, and yeah, other than that, not too much else to report. What about on your end, buddy?
Yeah, not too much to say on my end. I've still been busy with just everything, but yeah, not too much things that are worth reporting on the show at least. Yeah, just scrambling to get research stuff together, and which seems to be what I'm saying every week. But that's kind of how it goes.
Right.
um, yeah, but it turns out I think that your vacation also happened to be very well timed because the title slide of this episode we're actually using a photo that you took during your first visit to the museum. Isn't that right?
Yeah. This is Titanus, which is a terror bird that had lived in Florida. I think it was like one of the last ones that actually ever lived,
Mm-hmm.
and they had a nice full mount of it there attacking a tapir.
Yeah.
Um, and oh, it's impressive in person. I mean, the skeleton itself easily stood like 6 feet tall. Of course, it's arched here in attack, but if it was in full pose, like it would
Right.
tower over me. And I'm like 5'4", so
Right.
pretty impressive.
Definitely, yeah, yeah. So, indeed, today we are going to be talking about the terror birds and their relatives. Um, and, we've talked before on the show about uh, predatory birds, especially birds that hunt other vertebrates, like the raptors, which, as we discussed previously, turns out that we may have to start considering the group we're talking about today a group of raptors as well, even though they weren't traditionally placed under that label. Um, but when you think about birds of prey, you typically think about primarily flight-based predators that hunt from the sky and swoop down on their prey. But in fact, there has been a whole radiation of raptorial birds that has kind of decided to do something similar to what their stem bird ancestors did, like the other theropod dinosaurs, very well known for being um, ground dwelling terrestrial running predators during the Mesozoic. Well, this group of birds that we're going to talk about today decided they had a pretty good thing going, so maybe we should try that too. So they actually ventured into that niche for quite a bit and did some very interesting things. So today's group of birds we're going to talk about are the cariamiforms, and it's interesting because there are only 2 living species. So most of the species we're going to talk about in this episode are extinct and only known from fossils, and so I thought it was quite appropriate to use an image not of a living bird for this episode, but of a mount of a long extinct one. And furthermore, I think the terror birds, in fact, are probably even more famous in popular culture than their closest living relatives are. So that also is kind of a reason why I chose to use a terror bird skeleton as the title image.
Which is funny to think about because I don't know of many living animals that's phenomenon
Right,
can be
yeah.
used for, that their extinct relatives are more famous.
Right. Yeah, it is really quite curious, but I can see why, I suppose, because terror birds are these massive apex predators, and so, or at least many of them were. So yeah, it's easy to see why they would get some spotlight, whereas their closest living relatives, as we shall see, even though they are predatory birds, are quite a bit smaller. So yeah, let's go on to the next slide and kind of start talking about these birds in more detail. But
All
first,
right.
before we get into the cariamiforms themselves, let's put them in a bit of context. So, in the last few episodes, we've been talking about a huge, diverse group of birds called Teluraves. And Teluraves includes a lot of mostly tree dwelling, but also some ground dwelling birds, and so they are often called the core land birds. So they don't include all terrestrial birds, but they include a massive chunk of that diversity. In fact, the name Teluraves means land birds. Um, and we've already talked about many groups of Teluravians. We've talked about the vultures and hawks and eagles, the accipitramorphs. We've talked about the owls, strigiforms. We've talked about the caracimorphs, which are a big group of tree-dwelling birds mostly, with many different weird adaptations, especially in their feet. We talked about how they have all these different weird kinds of toe arrangements and all of that. And that group includes things like kingfishers and woodpeckers and hornbills and many other more obscure groups. So there is still one more lineage of Teluravians we have not yet covered in this show, and so that is this group pictured on this slide here, and that is Australavies. Um, and so Australavies includes the groups that are pictured here. So they include the group we're going to talk about today, the cariamiforms, but they also include the falcons, parrots, and passeriforms. And yeah, this is quite a motley group. I think this group, as you might suspect, was originally discovered using genetic data in the mid 2000s. And it was certainly a big surprise to people when it was first discovered, because no one previously had really considered that all of these groups might be each other's closest relatives. Um, but in fact, since then, we've done a lot of genetic analyses on birds, and pretty much consistently we always recover Australavies as a group. And so we can be pretty confident now that, as strange as it may seem, the cariamiforms, falcons, parrots, and passeriforms are close relatives and form this group Australavies. Now, so far, no one has really identified any anatomical features that definitely are shared among these groups. So that's something we're gonna have to continue to work on. But in any case, we are pretty sure that this group exists, and it is quite a diverse bunch, as you can see. Um, Now, because they are so diverse, I've decided to split up the Australavies into several different episodes, and so today we're just going to focus on the first group here, the cariamiforms. And something else you'll notice here is that, as we discussed before, the entire group Teluraves is currently hypothesized to have possibly descended from raptorial ancestors, so birds that primarily hunt other vertebrates. And part of the reason we think that is because of the kind of relationships that you can see here. You can see that even though the parrots and passeriforms, which for most part aren't raptorial, they form a group. They are each other's closest living relatives. Then, kind of their next closest living relatives are the falcons, which definitely are raptorial, and then the next group related to them is the cariamiforms, and they are also a raptorial group too. So it is fairly plausible that Australavians and Telleravians in general perhaps originally descended from a rather predatory and potentially carnivorous ancestor. All right, so let's go to the next slide and look at the cariamiforms specifically. So in terms of their known time range, as we shall see, they do have quite a good fossil record, and they are known from the Eocene onward. Now, the oldest known specimen, it was previously thought to be from the late Paleocene, but I think recent work has redated the rocks that it came from to early Eocene, but that still pretty early in the Paleogene period. There are only 2 living species of cariamiforms, and we'll get to them soon. But for most part, the great bulk of their diversity is known from the fossil record, and that's certainly a pretty curious pattern. We haven't seen that in many groups of birds. Now, as mentioned before, previously we didn't really suspect that the cariamiforms were closely related to things like falcons and parrots and songbirds. In fact, traditionally, they were thought to be members of the gruiforms. And we talked about gruiforms before. We talked about them in episode 6 of Dinosaurs, the second chapter, I believe. So that's a group that includes things like cranes and rails. And we also talked about how, traditionally a bunch of kind of ground-dwelling birds were thrown into the gruiform group. And then, when people took a closer look at both their anatomy and also were able to analyze their genetics, we found, actually, a bunch of these birds don't actually belong to the gruiform group at all. They're not closely related to the cranes and rails. And so one of these groups that was thrown out of the gruiforms was the cariamiforms. And so now the cariamiforms are kind of considered nested within Telleravians and within Australavians, and very far apart from the cranes and rails. Now, the cariamiforms mostly appear to be and have been terrestrial predators, and they have very long hind limbs. And they have a number of skeletal features that they seem to have in common. So, first of all, they have a block-like hypotarsus. We are seeing this structure again. The hypotarsus is a little projection that comes out of the base of the foot of the birds. Basically, their heel region, as you could say. And so that's the image to the top left here. So you can see the hypotarsus labeled HY. So on the left, you're seeing the foot kind of from the sole, as it were, even though this region of the foot would be held off the ground in birds, because again, birds walk on their toes, and so kind of the heel region of the foot is actually held off the ground most of the time when they're walking. And on the right, labeled the capital letter G, is looking from the base of the foot, so where it would connect to the shin, kind of down at the surface of the joint, and you can see the hypotarsus kind of projecting down from the sole there. And so we've talked a lot about the hypotarsus in this series, as it happens. And so we've talked about how in crown birds there's often a lot of a range of grooves and canals that kind of penetrate or run across the hypotarsus, and these are where the tendons, many of the tendons of the foot kind of run through. However, cariamiforms are distinctive in that they have a very simple kind of hypotarsus. You can see here that there is only a very shallow dip in the example pictured here, which is from a terror bird, as it happens. And so they have what we call a simple block-like hypotarsus that doesn't have any canals in it. So that seems to be a fairly distinctive feature of this group. You don't see that in many other crown birds. Their carpometacarpus, so we're talking about the hand now. The carpometacarpus in birds is basically the bones of the palm and the wrist, or some of the bones in the wrist that are fused together, and that's pictured on the lower right over here. So these are a couple of different cariamiform carpometacarpi. So pointing upward is the wrist of the wrist region of the carpometacarpus, and pointing downward here is a region that would be connecting to the fingers. And so the carpometacarpus tends to be relatively short in cariamiforms, and there's also what we say is a strongly bowed third metacarpal. So you can see that the metacarpal to the left here, so the palm bone most to the left here, is very arched. The thinner metacarpal there is very arched, and that seems to be a fairly common feature of birds with relatively short wings that don't usually fly very far, and that seems to be the case with many of the cariamiforms. Certainly the living species don't tend to fly for very long distances, and as we shall see, a lot of the extinct species were entirely flightless, so they don't seem to have been very fond of flying. And another third feature that I'll mention here regards a coracoid. The coracoid is a bone in the shoulder, and we don't have one anymore. We placental mammals don't have one, but most other land vertebrates do. And that is pictured on the top right over here. So some examples from a fossil and a living cariamiform, the coracoid. So the coracoid on one end, the end that's pointing towards the top here, that end connects to the shoulder blade and to the upper arm. And the other end, the end pointing towards the bottom here, it connects to the sternum or the breastbone. And so towards the top end, as pictured here, we call the kind of extreme top end or tip the acrocoracoid process. In cariamiforms, it kind of arches over and forms a loop with another kind of projection lower down on the coracoid. That's very distinctive. So that is also found in many cariamiforms. But as far as we can tell, it seems to be mostly found in the species that can fly. So a lot of the fossil flightless cariamiforms, because the acrocoracoid process is so reduced that it basically doesn't have a lot of these features anymore. But certainly in the flying cariamiforms, we do see this kind of loop in the coracoid, which is pretty unusual. All right, so I think first we can go to the living members of the group. But before we go on, do you have anything to add to this group in general?
Not particularly. This is
All right,
a well-rounded overview.
thanks. Alrighty then. So let's talk about the living representatives. And so they are a group that are known as the Seriemas. So again, only two living species, and they are only found in South America in the wild. Now, the crown group of Seriemas, so that's just the two living genera, are known from the fossil record from the Pliocene onward. And the reason I don't list the whole total group in here is because, since Seriemas are the only living cariamiforms, all the kind of fossil forms that don't belong to this group are stem members of the Seriema lineage. And so the total group of Seriemas is equivalent to cariamiforms as a group. Now, the Seriemas, even though they don't quite get to the gigantic sizes of their extinct terrorbird cousins, as we shall see, they are quite effective predators. So if you're wondering how big they get, they're about the size of a large chicken, but with much longer legs, so they're much taller. And so they will hunt pretty much any kind of small animal they can catch. They'll hunt insects, they'll hunt smaller vertebrates, such as smaller birds, small mammals, smaller reptiles, amphibians. Pretty much all of those are fair game. Occasionally they'll actually eat some plant material as well, so technically they are omnivorous. And the way they kill kind of large prey, especially things like fairly sizable snakes, is what they'll do is they'll grab the prey with their beak, and they'll shake it very hard and beat it against the ground again and again until it dies. And so that's how they kill their prey. And something else that Seriemas, if you've heard of them, are fairly well known for, is that they have a very hooked claw on the second toe of their foot, so the second innermost toe on their foot, which you can actually kind of see in the photo here, um, has a very sharp and arched claw on it. And usually they'll actually kind of hold this claw slightly retracted off the ground. So they have a somewhat a retractable second toe. And which presumably helps keep that claw sharp. And of course, if you are familiar with Mesozoic dinosaurs, you will immediately think of the similarity to groups like the Dromaeosaurids and the Troodontids, which also have a very similar kind of feature. And in the Dromaeosaurids and Troodontids, the kind of retractable nature of the claw and the size of the claw itself is even more well developed than it is in Seriemas. But Seriemas sort of have a version of it, and that's pretty cool. Now, this of course is a convergent evolution because we've already seen a whole series of birds that are more closely related to the Seriemas than to the Dromaeosaurids and Troodontids that don't have this feature. So that is definitely a convergent feature, a convergent trait. But it is pretty cool that we see this in this other kind of group of a living terrestrial ground-dwelling predatory theropods. Now, what is this claw for? Well, it is thought that in Dromaeosaurids, for example, they might have used a claw kind of similarly to things like hawks and eagles do today. And we talked about this back when we talked about hawks and eagles in their episode, which I think was episode 10? I'll have to check. But in any case, they tend to use a claw to kind of pin prey to the ground, and then basically, as the prey struggles, it kind of tears open its own wounds until it bleeds to death. And it is thought that Dromaeosaurids might have used a very similar kind of hunting strategy. Seriemas don't quite do that. They're not specialized for kind of grappling with prey and pinning it to the ground like that. So instead, they kind of use the beating the prey against the ground method I described earlier, but they do use the claw to kind of hold prey to the ground once it has already been subdued, and then they will then tear kind of pieces of the prey off with their beak while they're eating it. Now, even though they are ground-dwelling birds, Seriemas do still nest in trees, so that is quite interesting, and presumably that keeps them a bit safer from ground-dwelling predators. And yeah, Seriemas, they are definitely quite an unusual group. I have seen them occasionally in captivity, and they are always quite interesting characters, really. Like they have these very loud calls. I've heard them kind of calling really loudly in zoos, and yeah, they are. I've never obviously worked with them directly, but they do seem to be quite curious and inquisitive kind of birds. It's always a pleasure to see them. Have you seen them?
Well, I know Sylvan Heights Bird Park
Mm-hmm.
has Seriemas of this species pictured
Yeah.
here, and I was kind of excited to learn that. Unfortunately, I don't think they were on exhibit the
Oh
day I went.
no.
They were maybe doing maintenance or something, or they
Right.
might not have just been there, which is a real shame
You're right. Right.
because as far as I can remember, this is not a group of birds that I see often in
Mm-hmm.
captivity, at
No.
least in the zoos that I've been to. Because I like them quite a bit. They're very interesting. It's kind of a nice sort of parallel to what was going on in Africa.
Yes.
Because these look very similar to secretary birds in a
That's
number of
right.
ways, and they kind of do a lot of the same things that secretary birds do,
Right.
which is kind of fun. But no, I haven't seen these all that much in person.
Right.
I guess if I have, it would probably be taxidermy specimens in a
Mm.
museum.
Yeah.
Um, but that's usually always a guarantee with museums that have lots of birds.
Yeah.
Um,
True. True.
it's really funny talking about like relationships between birds.
Mm-hmm.
And I always thought this was weird. I don't know if you had any information on this. Um, I guess it was proposed at least once in the past
Mm-hmm.
that the Seriemas and the secretary birds were close relatives,
Mm.
which is kind of weird considering like where they are in the bird family tree now. Um, I don't know who on earth proposed that. I just remember seeing in a couple old books they would have
Mm.
like family tree of birds, and they put these two together on the same branch. And I was like, and even like then I was like, what? That's weird.
Right. Right. Yeah. yeah, I'm not sure who proposed that originally either. But yeah, I can see why people would think that because they certainly are similar in many ways. And we definitely talked about the secretary bird back in the hawk and eagle episode too, because that's where it actually does belong. Um, but uh, but yeah, I mean, well, I mean, whoever did propose that, they got closer than the traditional thinking that Seriemas were closely related to cranes and rails, because at least secretary birds and Seriemas are both members of Teleraves. So yeah, but definitely, I think their most of their similarities probably are most likely to some extent convergent. Um, but nonetheless, it is a it is pretty evident that they do have these at least ecological and functional similarities for sure. Yeah,
Gotcha. All right. Yeah, I figured as much. If I ever end up finding that information, we'll put it in the description or
of
something.
course. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, well, it's unfortunate that you haven't seen them before because yeah, they are full of character, but they definitely aren't common in zoos. I can tell you that. I know primarily the main place where I've seen them before is was at the National Zoo in Washington D.C. But I know their bird exhibit is currently undergoing a renovation, so I think a lot of the birds might not be on display at the moment. So we'll just have to see if they decide to put the Seriemas back on when that's done.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely been there, but it's just not coming to me.
Right, right, yeah. But yeah, so another place where remember seeing them was at was in Paris actually. Yeah, I was there in France for a conference, and near the conference venue they had a small zoo in the middle of a city park, and they had a bunch of in many cases quite obscure and exotic animals, and among them were Seriemas. So yeah, that was pretty cool to see. Um, but yeah, the closest thing you can get to seeing a living terror bird. Um, all right, so I guess we've done the two living species of cariamiforms, and I guess we're done with this episode. Well, of course not, because the reason I spun off this group into its own episode was because it has such a rich kind of fossil record. Um, all right, so let's go on to the next one. Let's start with a fossil that seems to be pretty similar and is pretty closely related to the modern Seriemas. So this is Myocariyama. It's a pretty straightforward name because Cariyama is one of the living genera of Seriemas, and it lived in the Miocene, so it's like Myocariyama. Now, this specimen actually has had a somewhat convoluted, I guess, taxonomic history. And in fact, this has been the case for many cariamiform fossils or possible cariamiform fossils, as we shall see. I guess probably because this group of birds has so many kind of weird and confusing features that kind of can potentially link them with so many other different groups. People have had a pretty long track record of confusing fossils of members of this group for other groups, and potentially vice versa, as we shall see. But in any case, Myocariyama was originally thought to be a specimen of what was then thought to be a stem Seriema called Noria gavis. But then it was found that the original specimen of Noria gavis was probably not a stem Seriema, but a fossil falcon. However, it turns out that the specimens that we now consider Myocariyama probably did belong to a stem Seriema, so they had to be split away from Noria gavis and given their own kind of genus and species. And so now they are called Myocariyama, and they represent one of the better kind of fossils that we have of stem Seriemas that are similar to modern Seriemas. And in fact, that fossil falcon that was confused for a fossil Seriema, Noria gavis, it has been kind of lumped into another genus of fossil falcon called Theornis, and so we'll cover that one in the next episode when we talk about falcons. But in any case, Myocariyama is known from a partial skeleton. It's not all the bones are shown here. I'm just showing the skull here, but it is known for a pretty complete skeleton for a bird fossil. And so the skull is pictured here, viewed from the side, and in the top you can see that this is the original fossil as it is preserved. It looks kind of funny. It looks a little bit like, I don't know, it's like Gonzo from the Muppets or something. But that's not the original shape of the skull. It has been distorted a little bit. So on the bottom here you can see that the authors who prepared this figure, they kind of adjusted the beak a little bit to kind of show what the original orientation probably was more like. And so yeah, it doesn't actually have this kind of down curved kind of skull.
Like the warping of fossils is so
Yeah.
interesting.
Oh yes, yes, yeah, yeah. It definitely can be can cause some major headaches for paleontologists. That's for sure. Um, but yeah, this is despite the distortion, this is a pretty good fossil. And in general, Myocariyama seems to have been pretty similar to the modern ones. Um, but it does have a few differences, and notably, its sternum, so its breastbone, is much deeper. So it has more area to attach kind of wing flapping muscles. So possibly it was more capable of long distance flight than the modern Kariyamas are. Modern Seriemas are, and yeah, as mentioned before, kind of modern Seriemas aren't really fans of flying very far. They'll fly short distances if they have to, or if they want to get into a tree or something. But overall, they don't usually do it much. So it's possible that we have here a Cariamiform that actually did, or it did kind of perform long distance flights, at least to some extent. Um, but yeah, that's kind of our best look at a fossil that is similar to modern Seriemas. But if we kind of go further down the family tree, we'll start to encounter groups that start doing, I guess, different things. And of course, the most famous group is the one that we'll meet on the next slide, and that's the Phorusrhacids, also popularly known as the terror birds. Yeah, and this is an extremely diverse group, and I think the next slide I'll show kind of a sampling of the species that have been discovered. But for now, let's do a quick overview. Um, so the oldest known terror bird fossils come from the Eocene. Those are pretty fragmentary, but certainly from the Oligocene onwards, we start finding you know pretty good terror bird fossils, primarily from South America. And as we shall see later, due to a major kind of biogeographic event, they also made it up into North America as well later in their history. And furthermore, there are some Eocene fossils um, that some paleontologists think might be early terror birds that come from Europe and Africa. That would be pretty wild. That would imply a very kind of broad distribution for a flightless bird group. Um, but those fossils, they're mostly consist of like handfuls or even just isolated individual bones. So not all paleontologists agree with that assessment. They might be terror birds or they might belong to some other large terrestrial bird group. It's hard to tell. So yeah, maybe we have African European terror birds, but definitely South America was the center of their diversity. Now, terror birds span a huge range of sizes. Definitely the really big ones are very well known. So in terms of body mass, they could get around the same size as a lion or so over 200 kilograms. And in terms of height, the big ones, definitely over 2 meters. They were, yeah, very big birds, but not all terror birds were that big. They kind of spanned, from the smallest ones were around the size of a turkey, so bigger than modern Seriemas, but not that much bigger. And they kind of span the whole range of sizes in between turkey size to lion size. So they kind of occupied a big range of kind of medium sized to large predator niches in their ecosystems. And the last of the terror birds, for sure, lived. The ones that we know for sure are terror birds. Lived during the Pliocene, but there have been some specimens as young as the late Pleistocene that have been suggested to belong to terror birds. Now, if this is the case, these were some of the smaller species of terror birds. So, as we shall see, the giant terror birds do seem to have disappeared at the end of the Pliocene. Um, but yeah, it is possible that kind of some of the smaller terror bird species made it all the way into the Pleistocene. So that's pretty interesting.
I guess it kind of goes without saying that some of our viewers have probably seen a film called 10,000
Oh,
BC
yeah.
um, by Roland Emmerich, who does disaster films.
Right.
Yeah, that I mean, even ignoring the fact that this is a movie with a bunch of flaws. One of the key scenes in there is that the main characters, who are Paleolithic peoples, are chased by a bunch of enormous terror birds
Yes.
um, in Eurasia, of all places. And yeah, like that's definitely not that never seems to have happened at
No.
all.
No, yeah. It doesn't seem like the giant terror birds ever encountered modern type humans, and they don't seem to have been around in Europe. So yeah, but yeah, I that is one of the few kind of big screen depictions of terror birds. However, so I guess that's kind of interesting.
Oh yeah, and it's funny because people, like, even so, like, a lot of people didn't know what they were. They
Mhm.
thought that the filmmakers had made up, like, what was the word they used? A Velosa ostrich or something? It's meant to be real animals, but the timing is off, and it was all a mess.
Right, right. Well, I guess a velociraptor ostrich is not a terrible kind of description of what a terror bird was like. Uh, but yeah, they were real animals. That much is true. Um, so let's talk a little bit about some of the distinctive features that terror birds have. Um, so one of their most unusual features, in fact, was that they had an akinetic skull. And what this means is that the skull doesn't have any mobile joints in it, other than the jaw joint that opens and closes the mouth. And at first glance, you might think that's not so weird. We have an akinetic skull, and that is true. But it is weird for a crown bird, as we've talked about before on the show. Crown birds have several other joints in the skull other than the jaw joint that are mobile. For example, at the base of the beak, there's usually a joint that flexes the upper beak up and down. At the back of the skull, there is often a joint above the jaw joint that can kind of swing back and forth, which also kind of helps with the flexure of the upper beak. But in terror birds, these joints were not mobile, it seems. And yeah, that is very strange for crown birds. And it is quite plausible that this was an adaptation to help them kind of bring down relatively larger prey, to make the skull, kind of more solid and more robustly built. And we will see in a little bit how the mechanism by which we think that terror birds might have killed their prey. And in light of that, I think having an akinetic skull would make a fair bit of sense. Yeah, so probably they were akinetic because they were using their beak to kind of kill relatively large prey items. Um, as far as we know, terror birds mostly seem to have been flightless. Certainly the big ones definitely were. But some paleontologists have suggested that maybe a few of the smaller species of terror birds might have still been able to fly. So they say this mainly because, for one thing, those smaller species, they are still within the size range of flight-capable birds, like, wild turkeys can fly, and these smaller terror birds were around turkey size. And for another is that their forelimbs don't seem to be quite as reduced as we see in the big terror birds, and in fact they still seem to have various functional joints between the finger joints, for example, and the wrist joints, that usually are more limited in motion in flightless birds. And so people have suggested that maybe it is plausible, perhaps, that some of these smaller terror birds could fly. Now, even if they could, um, they probably weren't very strong flyers. They probably weren't any better than living Seriemas, but it is possible. It will take kind of probably more detailed kind of modeling work to figure out for sure whether or not they could, but it is possible. Um, Something you might have seen in popular books about prehistoric life is you might have seen these depictions of terror birds with huge claws on their wings, and you might even have seen them described as having re-evolved kind of grasping hands to capture their prey with. Um,
Mhm.
and that was an idea that was proposed in the 90s, I think. Unfortunately, it is almost certainly not true. So the reason that this was suggested was that because some people had noticed that in the carpometacarpus of terror birds, where the thumb would attach to the carpometacarpus, um, there is a very large kind of a ball-shaped joint for the thumb to attach to, and so some people interpreted that as kind of, oh, it's to increase the mobility of the thumb, and so maybe they had functional wing claws they could use to capture their prey with. Um, but there's actually no good evidence for this because Seriemas, modern Seriemas, actually have this feature too, and they definitely don't use wing claws for capturing their prey. Um, and in fact, we do have a few examples of kind of relatively complete terrorbird forelimbs now, and they definitely don't show any evidence for kind of this re-evolution of giant grasping wing claws. So unfortunately, it's a cool image, but it's almost certainly not true. Um, and there are a few other features that terrorbirds have that are shared specifically with the Seriemas, and not so much with the other extinct members of cariamiforms. And so one of these features is a very short hallux. So again, this is the innermost toe in birds that typically points backwards. Yeah, it is highly reduced in both Seriemas and terrorbirds, which makes a lot of sense because they probably weren't spending much of any of their time in trees. That's the typical function that you see in birds is that the hallux is used for grasping, especially perches. And also, like modern Seriemas, terrorbirds also had a strongly curved claw on the second toe, and so it is possible that they were also usually holding this claw off the ground, like modern Seriemas do. As far as I know, there hasn't been too much detailed study on like kind of the biomechanics of terrorbird feet and whether or not they had this kind of retractable mechanism, but it definitely seems quite plausible that they did. Um, and the specific terrorbird that is pictured here is one of the most completely known terrorbirds. You can see all the bones in white here are preserved, so we have an almost complete skeleton of this terrorbird called Shashawavis from the Pliocene of Argentina, and that's apparently how you say its name, despite how it's spelled. Yeah, I first heard that at a conference talk once, and yeah, I was surprised too. But yeah, that's apparently how it's said. And yeah, we even have a big chunk of its windpipe preserved, as you can see in this image. Yeah, the kind of bony rings that go around the windpipe are preserved to a large extent in this fossil. So this is definitely one of our most complete looks at what terrorbird anatomy was like. Now, this was one of the relatively smaller species. It wasn't one of the smallest species, but it was still pretty small for a terrorbird. But yeah, excellent fossil. So that was a really cool specimen for sure. Do you have anything to add before we go into more detail about various aspects of Phorusrhacid biology?
Not particularly. This is actually a really incredible specimen that you show here.
Mm.
It's always kind of a treat when you get like a relatively complete fossil of an animal, especially like so like late in time too,
Yeah,
and one that is not, even though like we have like living representatives of this group today, like one is like more derived than what we have
right.
is just amazing.
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, there has been some phylogenetic work kind of done trying to figure out how all the different terror birds are related to each other. Um, I wouldn't say there's a very strong consensus so far. Different studies have found different topologies, but partially that's because there haven't been that many studies done to begin with. But this is one of the latest phylogenies, so that's the one I'm showing here. And in fact, this was part of the description of that, a really complete fossil I showed on the previous slide, Shasha Wavis. They basically put together a big data set of terror birds, and this was the phylogeny they found. And so, what you can notice here, among other things, is that the the kind of darker silhouettes represent the larger species that are ostrich-sized or bigger. And so one thing that you can notice is that it seems that large body size evolved at least a couple times within the terror birds. So you can see on the left-hand side, Mesembryornis got to ostrich-sized thereabouts, but you also have a whole series of gigantic terror birds on the right-hand side of the phylogeny. So these seem to represent kind of independent origins of giant body size. But there were also quite a few terror birds that were much smaller than that. So you can see things like Silopterus in forming a clade in the middle. The various species of Silopterus were pretty small. These were the turkey-sized ones were slightly bigger. Um, and yeah, it seems that in general you can split, at least according to this study, the terror birds into a kind of more overall smaller and more slender clade, and overall more robust and gigantic clade, even though there is quite a bit of size variation in both of these groups. So you can see that a bunch of different terror bird species have been named, in contrast to the two living species of Seriemas that we have today. So this was a very diverse group. Um, all right, so that's kind of covers about their diversity and phylogeny, I guess.
This just came to my mind looking at this figure
Yeah.
actually. Um, if you've been following the series from the beginning, like this probably shouldn't be surprising to you. But in case like you're just tuning in for the very first time, Gastornis
Oh yeah.
and Brontornis and all of those other larger birds, like they do not belong to this group. Like they're not associated with it. They kind of independently evolved their large size from more distantly related groups. Um, I mentioned that just because, like, I know growing up in a lot of like popular literature, they would often talk about Gastornis, or as it was known, Diatrema,
Yeah.
as a member of this group. You know, like the terror birds, including the great Gastornis, and um, it can be a little bit confusing because they do kind of look similar.
Right.
And I'm also noticing like some two of the silhouettes here. Uh, that actually comes from a Burian painting of Gastornis, incidentally.
Yeah, I guess they put them here to kind of represent the more robust species of terror birds, but yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good addition, for sure. Yeah, Gastornis was a Paleocene to Eocene giant flightless bird, but it was not a member of the terror bird group, and in fact, we don't even think that it was a predatory bird anymore. It was probably more likely a herbivore. Um, and it seems to have been more closely related to, of all things, chickens and ducks. So if you want to hear us talk about Gastornis and some other similar birds, you can go back to episode 3 of Dinosaurs, the second chapter, and that's where we cover that.
Mhm.
All right, so if we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about how we think terror birds might have fed and hunted. So there's been a little bit of work done on this, particularly on a specimen with a very complete skull. This belongs to the genus Endolgalornis, and this was I guess, medium-sized terror bird. It wasn't one of the gigantic species, but it was around the size of, oh, I don't know, like an emu maybe. So it was still a pretty big bird. And so what people have done is that they've studied its skull and also its neck to try and figure out how it might have used these parts of its body, presumably in feeding and hunting. Um, so one thing that they've done, as pictured on the left-hand side here, is they've applied a technique called finite element analysis to the skull of this terror bird. And this is now a very popular kind of method for studying biomechanics in living and extinct animals. But it actually originated in civil engineering and aeronautics. Basically, finite element analysis, and keep in mind that I am not a biomechanist or an engineer, but a very kind of basic description of it, I guess, would be it's a way to study how complex shapes behave, and the way it works is basically it splits up these complex shapes into little blocks, and little elements. That's what the elements in the finite element analysis refers to, and then you can specify kind of the properties of each of these elements. So say it's made of bone, and what are the properties of bone? You can enter that into the analysis. How much force does it take before bone fractures, or whatever. You can enter all of those into a finite element analysis, and then because you use all these simpler elements to build up into this complex shape, then you can run it through various simulations, apply forces to the object, and then see how the object behaves in response. And so this has been used to kind of study things like how hard certain extinct animals could bite, or how they might have fed in terms of mechanics, what kind of motions they might have used, things like that. And so it has become a really kind of popular method in paleontology, even though it originated for engineering, for kind of calculating whether buildings or vehicles can sustain a certain amount of weight, things like that. So what they did was that they built up this terror bird skull model using that method, and then they kind of simulated different ways of using the skull. So on the top is what happened when they simulated the bird shaking something from side to side with its beak. In the middle is just a simple kind of straightforward biting, up and down kind of jaw motion, and then on the bottom is kind of pulling back, so grabbing something and then pulling it backwards. What the different colors on the skull show is that red indicates really high stresses that the skull or the parts of the skull are experiencing, and the colors closer to blue are kind of lower stresses. And so if you see a skull or any bone kind of experiencing really high stress under a certain condition, we tend to infer that it probably wasn't very well adapted for doing this behavior. And so from the study, the researchers concluded that terror birds primarily weren't kind of shaking their prey from side to side when they were attacking, and probably more likely they were attacking their prey with vertical kind of strikes. So they would bring the head downward and use a very hooked tip of the bill to strike the prey like an axe almost. That does seem to be fairly plausible. Those are huge bills with a great big hook on the end. Definitely, I would be surprised if they weren't using that to bring down their prey. And a second study done a few years later also looked at the neck of the same species of terror bird, and they found that it had adaptations for kind of pulling the really heavy kind of head back upwards, and so probably that was necessary because when this bird was doing these vertical strikes with its head, it would of course have to be able to bring its head back upwards to a neutral position, and so yeah, that also seems consistent with this kind of behavior, and is currently, at least, the leading model on how we think these terror birds might have hunted. And it wouldn't surprise me if they were also using their feet as well to maybe kick prey or stomp on prey, because they do have these very large talons on that are also very sharp on their feet. So that's also a possibility. But yeah, that possibility hasn't really been subjected to this kind of rigorous modeling yet. Do you have anything else to add to this?
That's very fascinating. I at the Florida Museum they had a cast of a Titanus foot.
Right.
That one of those things like they compare it to a living bird and it's all in bronze, so you can like put your hands all over it to compare. Yeah, I would kind of second that idea that the feet might have been used because like that was a very serious foot. Just the hooked claws and everything. It's like it dwarfed my hand. I could very easily see that. The axe movement of the head is really interesting because I remember seeing that discussed in the context of like Allosaurus
Yes.
and related animals, where the head just being brought down, and that's like sort of the main motion of striking at prey. And
Right.
I don't know how much that's been substantiated, but I thought that was an interesting parallel.
Yeah, definitely. I know like the strict kind of axe model where Allosaurus would kind of open its mouth really wide and kind of slam its upper jaw down on its prey. It has been questioned by some subsequent studies. Um, yeah, partly because basically it would be very difficult to do that with a very large prey item if you couldn't open your mouth wide enough, essentially. But yeah, in terms of like the general kind of motion, there have been other studies done on say the neck musculature of Allosaurus that show probably kind of use a sort of pull back kind of feeding motion that would have been similar to the way that a lot of raptorial birds today feed, and so yeah, I think in general terms there probably are still some parallels, even if we don't think the strict kind of axe model is necessarily correct anymore. But that definitely reminded me of that too. Um,
Gotcha. I mean, I guess thinking going through the animal kingdom,
yeah,
I'm not familiar with any living animals that would use their head like an axe to
right,
kill.
right.
Nothing is coming to mind unless you know of anything.
Yeah, that Yeah, not exactly. I guess. Of course, we also don't really have any living animals that are built like allosaurids or terror birds today,
Right.
with such a massive head. So yeah, it's true. It does seem. Uh, yeah, at least that I can think of at the moment. I can't think of any extant analog that really does this, but probably that's in part because we don't have anything that's really doing the exact same thing as those animals were.
Yeah, that's kind of cool. It's like hunting behaviors, among other things, that are just lost forever until they
Right. Yeah.
evolve again in whatever distant future.
Yeah, exactly. I guess something else that's worth mentioning here is that they're only modeling the kind of effects of the bony parts of the skull in the study, so they're not considering like the keratin covering that would have been covering the beak portion of the skull,
Ooh,
and
yeah.
so it has been shown in other studies that having a keratin covering on the beak is can be pretty useful for dissipating stresses to the skull. So that's definitely something worth keeping in mind with these studies. Is that you can see, for example, in the biting and the pullback motions, you can see very high stresses on the tip of the beak there. But it's possible that with the keratin covering there, that could mitigate those stresses. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that probably Phorusrhacids were not as well adapted for lateral shaking than they were for more vertical kind of motions of the head. So yeah, that does seem to provide a clue as to how they might have hunted and fed.
Okay, that's cool.
All right, so on the next slide, we can also look at some studies that have looked at how terror birds moved. Um, and so there have been a few studies on this subject. In general, terror birds, because they have these really long legs relative to their body size, um, and also partly because modern Seriemas are quite good and fast runners, they have generally been considered to be a cursorial, that is, specialized for running. Um, and in general, that does seem to have been the case. However, there was this study. What they did was they kind of they took measurements of the proportions of the, I think, the tarsometatarsals of various flightless birds. And so the tarsometatarsals is the fused foot and ankle bones in birds. And they found that basically birds with more slender tarsometatarsai in living flightless birds who tended to be more cursorial, and so they applied this to extinct flightless birds, including a range of terror birds. And they found that even though most terror birds did indeed plot among the cursorial kind of taxa, they did find a few exceptions to this. So Bathornis and Kalenkin, both of which were really big terror birds, some of the largest terror birds that we know about, their foot proportions tend to plot more among what we call the graviportal birds. And graviportal basically means that they are not specialized for running fast, but more for like weight support, for stability. And
Hmm.
so these birds, it seems, may not have been as cursorial as the other terror birds. And so the author suggested that maybe they were not running down prey so much, but maybe they were more ambush predators, perhaps. So it does seem that there was some variation in how terror birds were moving. Not They weren't all just fast running predators, perhaps.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I
Hmm.
mean, the larger you get, like I feel like the larger you get, like the slower like you can move
Mm,
for the most part. We think about like elephants and rhinos, like
right.
they can run, but they're not like remarkably fast as far as
Yeah.
smaller animals can be. There's a reason why a T-Rex couldn't outrun a Jeep
Right.
or
Right. Right.
anything like that. It's just too big, and of course
Yeah.
its prey animals probably weren't that fast either.
Right.
Of course, I guess it's a question of like what was Kellenkin and
Mm.
similar birds chasing after
Right.
when
Right.
they could.
Exactly. Yeah, it is interesting because a lot of the large herbivorous mammals that were around in South America, living alongside the terror birds, many of them were not fast runners. I mean, a few of them I think were, but there were quite a range of more graviportal kind of prey items. So definitely,
Yeah.
I could see a graviportal predator making a living in those ecosystems. Um, and yeah, that is true to a point that the bigger you get, it's harder for you to move quickly, right? It basically, in general, the way it works is that animals do increase in speed as they get bigger to a point because they are able to increase their stride length at bigger sizes. But once you get big enough that your mass becomes too hard for you to move as at those speeds, that kind of effect kind of plateaus off, and you start getting a dip in kind of the speed you can attain. Um, and
Yeah, it's a
so,
catch.
right. Yeah, so kind of in general, the fastest running animals that we have are, yeah, not tiny animals, but they are moderately sized in the grand scheme of things. Think things like antelopes and cheetahs and ostriches. So they're decently sized animals, but they're not multi-ton giants. Um, so yeah, and now in general, crowned birds don't seem to have gone into the multi-ton range, but it does seem that they do follow a general trend where the larger species in general were more graviportal, the really giant species in general were more graviportal, and kind of the really cursorial species were spanning the mid-size range in terms of the crowned bird size variation. So yeah,
Yeah, like their adaptations to running
right.
that helped a lot of those animals, and
Mm-hmm.
the same laws of physics apply throughout the animal kingdom. Um, like kaiju and things probably couldn't exist because of mass issues, and just like the limbs um, would just destroy you. So
Yeah, exactly.
certainly for a bird to be like as big as, oh, I don't know, a sauropod, which I mean, I guess of course you can play of, oh, what is a bird, and you have like the bird extremists who are like, oh, triceratops is a bird,
Right,
like
right.
that we talked about early in the series. um but that's beside the point. Certainly those limitations are there.
Right. Yeah, definitely. All right, so let's go on to the next slide on here. So here I'm talking about a few things about senses, or specifically hearing, in terror birds. So on the left here are two Seriemas, the two living species of Seriemas, and on the right here are two terror birds that have well-preserved regions of the skull, and specifically in what we're really looking at here are the inner ear structures of these birds. So the kind of loopy looking kind of structure that you're seeing taking up most of the image here. Those are the inner ear, or at least the kind of bony sections of the skull that the inner ear fits into. And we actually talked about this kind of on a recent episode, right? We talked in our latest news episode about looking at inner ears in extinct theropods. And so,
Yeah.
here's an example of doing that. And so in the inner ear, there are several different structures. So there are the semicircular canals, and those are the kind of the loopy loop parts on the top of the inner ear. Um, and those are structures that are related to the sense of balance in animals. And pretty much all vertebrates have these semicircular canals. And yeah, they basically detect when your head is tilted, when you need to readjust yourself, are you getting off balance, things like that. So that's what the inner ear canals do. There has been a lot of research trying to figure out whether we can figure out certain aspects of the biology of animals by looking at their semicircular canal structure, and it is actually quite controversial because it seems that there are a lot of factors that go into inner ear shape besides just kind of biology or behavior, things like that. Like there was a pretty recent study that found, for example, that skull shape matters a lot in determining the shape of the semicircular canals, which makes sense, right? But that does mean that we might not be able to rely on the semicircular canals alone to kind of infer things like head posture or behavior, or things that people have tried to do in the past. But on the bottom part of the inner ear kind of structure is the cochlear duct, and that's where the cochlea, or the kind of the coiled snail shell region of the inner ear, which you might have seen if you looked at diagrams of ear anatomy. That's where that structure fits into. And we talked about recently on the news episode how you can use the size of the cochlear duct to infer the hearing frequencies that these animals might have heard at, or at least get a range of values for possibilities. And so people have done this because we have these preserved inner ear canals for some of these terror birds. Try to figure out what sounds terror birds might have been most adapted to hearing. And it turns out that as far as birds go, and this is actually similar to extant Seriemas, um, uh, terror birds seem to tend to been more specialized for hearing relatively low frequency sounds. Um,
Hmm.
yeah. So that's both similar to modern Seriemas and also similar to things like paleonates, things like ostriches and cassowaries. They also are good at hearing low frequency sounds and in fact also communicate using low frequency sounds, as we might have talked about this during the paleonate episode. It is possible that maybe terror birds were also communicating using primarily very deep kind of calls, which would make sense for such large birds to have done. That's pretty interesting. What do you think?
Yeah, so they probably weren't, open mouth shrieking like some popular culture will show.
True. Yeah. Maybe they were also doing like a more booming or kind of rumbling, growling noises. Yeah.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I mean, I've been near emus
Yeah.
making booming noises, and I mean that's like there's a power to it. Like you feel it in your chest.
Yeah.
But to see
Definitely.
like a 7-foot terror bird doing
Mm.
the same thing would probably be
Right.
like,
Right.
whoa.
Yeah, for sure. That would have been quite the experience. Yeah, probably scary too if you didn't have any measures to keep you safe. Um, Yeah, definitely. And I guess for the record, mammals in general tend to hear higher frequencies than birds do. Our hearing range is actually greater than that of most birds, and our maximum kind of the highest frequency sounds that we can detect is higher than pretty much all birds. Like that has to do with how we mammals structured our ears. But that's a story that doesn't belong in this series.
Sure. I'm just thinking about one of my favorite films ever is a little quirky fact about me. It's a 1955 film called Journey into Prehistory from the
Hmm.
Czech Republic.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah.
you and I, we watched it a couple of
That's
times.
right. Hmm.
It's basically it's four boys and they go back in time down a river, and as they go back in time, they life changes around them, and it's treated as like a scientific expedition. The boys just kind of want to have their own adventure. And in one scene, one of them is attacked by a terror bird, and it's a
Hmm.
really dramatic scene, and also kind of a hilarious scene because it's kind of one of those things where sometimes in movies your character's running away from a danger, and
Yeah.
like the danger is clearly faster than them, but the character still is able to like get away in time.
Right.
So you see this boy just like running through the leaves, like not like you know super fast, but he's having a good pace, and then this bird is just zooming towards him through the bush. It's like you should have caught up with him like in a second.
Right.
Um,
Right.
oh, it's so funny. And of course, the thing is way oversized too.
Hmm.
It's it's house size that these are packing in.
Right.
Oh, but no, it's a great film. The art alone is worth a watch
Hmm.
because they
Yeah.
do a combination of things to bring the animals to life. Of course, this is the 50s, so we're not talking about like CGI creations like in Jurassic Park. You got
Right.
stop motion, but then they have like uh, cutout models that kind of move the limbs a little bit, and then they
Hmm.
do like a painterly animation style in some instances that
Yeah. Yeah.
oh, it's just gorgeous. And occasionally it shows up on YouTube. I think it's there now. If you're ever interested in seeing it, can't recommend it enough. And it also, and I think this is the case for a lot of like European countries where like fossil mammals seem to be very popular
Hmm.
compared to like dinosaurs and things. So the film is very Cenozoic heavy,
Yeah.
um, where the boys are just going through all kinds of grasslands with antelope and elephants and saber tooths and things, and it's just nice, just a nice experience.
Yeah, definitely. It is a really interesting film, and yeah, like you said, we watched it together a couple of times. Yeah, it's pretty cool. I do encourage people to check it out as well. All right, let's go on to the next slide then. Okay, so next we're going to talk about a kind of a major event that seems to have greatly affected the terror birds and also many of their contemporaries as well. And this was what we call the Great American Biotic Interchange. Now, this major kind of biogeographic event seems to have come about because of the formation of the Isthmus of Panama. And so prior to the formation of this kind of landmass, the continents of South America and North America were separated from each other by the ocean. And so they each had their own kind of distinctive faunas that, for most part, did not intermix. But with the formation of the isthmus and the closure of the Central American Seaway, there was now a land connection that could allow animals from the north to move south and animals from the south to move north, and that brought about some apparently quite major ecosystem changes to these regions. Now, in terms of the timing of this event, that is actually a subject of big discourse, or more specifically, the timing of the formation of the Isthmus of Panama has recently become the subject of much discourse. So the kind of classic idea is that the full, complete formation of the Isthmus of Panama, in terms of the formation of a complete land connection between North and South America, that did not happen until the Pliocene, and that's when we start seeing this huge interchange of faunas, with a lot of South American animals going north and a lot of North American animals going south. But there have been a number of recent studies that have argued that, in fact, the Isthmus of Panama was already in place long prior to that, like maybe even as early as 15 million years ago in the Miocene. And as far as I can tell from, searching the literature in preparation for this episode, I don't think this debate has been completely resolved yet. And so I show here on the left kind of one of the models that have been recently proposed for the formation of the isthmus. And so in this one, they favor a relatively early origin of the isthmus. And so they show on the bottom, right here at 19 million years ago, the isthmus still has not fully formed yet, although there's already a pretty long land connection stretching towards South America. And then at 10 million years ago, there is already mostly closed seaway. The Central American Seaway is already mostly closed here. And then at 4 million years, there's pretty much a complete land connection between North and South America. And of course, in the modern day, that land connection has grown since then, due to tectonic activity that has squeezed out the kind of isthmus from the ocean. But yeah, there is a fair bit of discourse. We do know that prior to the commonly accepted data, there were already some exchanges taking place between North and South America in terms of the biota. We do start seeing things like relatives of raccoons, for example, showing up in South America, even though they originated in North America in the Miocene. And we have some examples of things like ground sloths, which originated in South America up in North America, relatively early on. So yeah, it's still an ongoing debate, I guess, in terms of the actual timing of these land masses. But I guess it's probably fair to say that the acceleration of the interchange probably did occur relatively late in the Pliocene, probably because more of the isthmus came into place, no matter what the exact timing was like of its origin. And so on the right here is a figure from Wikipedia showing kind of examples of animals that move north versus animals that moved south. And so the animals in brown shown over the continent of North America are immigrants from the south that originated in South America that moved up into North America. And then on the bottom, the animals in blue are animals that were originally found in North America that immigrated south into South America during this event. And even into the modern day, some of these groups still have descendants living in these respective regions. And so there was a huge restructuring of the ecological communities here. And so, yeah, let's take a look at who was involved in this interchange. Okay, let's see who moved up from South America first. Um, So South America was an island continent prior to the formation of the Isthmus of Panama during the Cenozoic, and so it had this weird assemblage of animals. There were, of course, the terror birds that we've been talking about in this episode, and you can see one picture there over appropriate that close to Florida, because that's where we found terror bird fossils that made it up there after the interchange. But there were lots of weird mammals as well. So there were marsupials and stem marsupials that were living in South America. In fact, in addition to the terror birds, some of the top predators of South America prior to the interchange were a group of stem marsupials called the Sparacidonts. And we've talked about previously on the show a very unusual Sparacidont called Thylacosmilus, that had these like kind of saber teeth, basically had really long canines, and there has been a recent debate in the literature about exactly kind of what its feeding and hunting strategy was like, whether it was kind of behaving more like the saber-toothed cats that we might be more familiar with or not. But yeah, that's an ongoing thing. Thylacosmilus did not make it, did not participate in this kind of Great American Interchange, but there were marsupials that did. And so the opossums that we see living in North America today, they are descendants that moved up from this as a result of this event. Yeah, and even today, a lot of people don't know this, is that there is a huge diversity of opossums that are still alive today in South America. It's not just the one species that we have up in the States and neighboring regions. But yeah, so that's one of the animals that moved up. In terms of kind of large herbivores of South America, there was a group called well, there is still a group called Xenarthrans, even though they aren't large herbivores anymore. So the Xenarthrans, they include today the sloths, armadillos, and anteaters. And in the past, even though today they are quite a motley crew, in the past they were even more diverse, and so they were some of the large herbivores that lived in South America. And you got things like the ground sloths. And something interesting is that the tree sloths living today, so there are two groups of tree sloths living today, the two-toed sloths and the three-toed sloths. They are not each other's closest relatives when you take the ground sloths into account. There are some ground sloths that are more closely related to the three-toed sloths, and there are some ground sloths that are more closely related to the two-toed sloths. And so, yeah, these two tree-dwelling groups kind of evolved. They're very similar kind of arboreal habits independently of each other, even though they're both sloths, which is really interesting. And they also happen to be the two groups of sloths that are alive today, because the other ground sloths, well, the other sloths in general, they seem to have died out during the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions, and we've talked plenty about those on this show. Yeah, causes of which are highly debated, but in any case, it led to the extinction of many of the large animals that were alive, just a few thousand years ago. But yeah, the Xenarthrans were quite a successful group moving up into North America. Ground sloths made it as far north as Alaska, for example. There was another group of Xenarthrans called the Glyptodonts, and these were a group of giant armadillos, herbivorous armadillos. So most living armadillos are omnivores or insectivores. But yeah, they used to have these specialized herbivorous relatives, the Glyptodonts, and they had these huge, basically armored shells covering themselves. So in living armadillos, the kind of armor forms these kind of mobile plates or kind of joints. So if you look at an armadillo, you can see like this kind of jointed middle that it has that allows them to flex their backs and things, and in some cases roll up into a protective ball. Now this was not the case in Glyptodonts because the entire kind of armor, the shell on the back was just one piece, and so there was no kind of flexure going on there. But because the Glyptodonts were so big, they probably didn't have much to worry about from predators anyways. Yeah, these were like car-sized armadillos. Um, and I guess if you're wondering, yeah, there are recent phylogenetic studies based on both genetics, because there are some glyptodons that only died out a few thousand years ago, so people have been able to get some genetic sequences from them based on both genetic sequences and anatomy. They tend to find that glyptodons are in fact a lineage of armadillos. They are nested within the armadillo clade. So yeah, they aren't just like closely related to armadillos. They are armadillos themselves, and so they also made it up into North America as well. And of course, the kind of more normal-looking armadillos did eventually make it up here too. And today, you can still see like nine-banded armadillos in the southern states.
I definitely saw a couple while I was in Florida.
Oh yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, yeah. The nine-banded armadillos, I think, are relatively kind of recent arrival. They didn't come immediately up during the great biotic interchange when it started. But yeah, they've definitely taken advantage of that land connection. Um, Another group of large South American herbivores was a group called, well, okay, I say a group, but that is actually debated for reasons we'll get to.
Hmm.
So there is a group called the South American native ungulates, and so these were hoofed mammals, and they came in all kinds of shapes and sizes. And they seem to have been in South America from very early on, in the Cenozoic at least. And yeah, there were these large, kind of almost hippo-like forms. They're probably not very fast runners, but there were also some that seemed to have been more slender and more better adapted for running. They're even like really small, kind of rabbit-like forms. Yeah, they were really diverse. But kind of the million-dollar question is, what were they? Because they have features that are shared with many other groups of mammals. And yeah, that has been traditionally been a big problem for us to try and figure out, and it still is a big problem. Now, there were a few of these South American native ungulates that made it up north during this great American biotic interchange, and some of the forms in South America, I think, didn't die out until the Pleistocene, and so those ones, like Toxodon and Macrauchenia. So yeah, Toxodon was one of these so-called hippo-like forms, even though it wasn't necessarily aquatic. And Macrauchenia was a more slender form, that has often been depicted with a trunk because it has a really weird skull. And so some people have speculated that maybe this was indicative of a trunk. That is actually we're actually not sure about that. That is controversial. Maybe it was something else going on with the soft tissues of its skull. But anyways, these two are some of the more recent kind of some of the last South American native ungulates to go extinct, and so people have been able to get kind of protein sequences from their bones, and results of analyzing those suggest that Toxodon and Macrauchenia, at least, were closely related to perissodactyls, and so those are the odd-toed ungulates. And so the living representatives of the odd-toed ungulates are the horses, rhinos, and tapirs. And so it seems to suggest that at least some of these South American native ungulates, or also called sanus for short, were closely related to odd-toed ungulates. But the thing is that because Sanus were so diverse, they came in all these different groups, that we're actually not sure if all of these Sanus form a clade in themselves. They might be all have evolved from very different kind of origins, and all just decide to become like kind of ungulate like forms. So yeah, that is something we're still not sure about, and most of them are too ancient for us to extract any kind of molecular material from as of yet. And so yeah, that's still a big puzzle in terms of like mammalian phylogenetics. Yeah, that they're a big mystery, but they were a really big and important group in South America during this time period. Um, all right, who else was around in South America? Ah, yes, the caviomorph rodents. Yeah, so this is a group of rodents that formed a big radiation in South America. This is a group that includes things like guinea pigs and capybaras and New World porcupines and a bunch of others. Yeah, like chinchillas and agoutis and pacas and yeah, tons and tons of these rodents. And they arrived in South America early on from Africa, as a matter of fact. So their closest living relatives still live in Africa today. Things like mole rats. Think of the naked mole rat, for example, and the Old World porcupines, which evolved kind of their prickly defenses independently of the New World species. And so it seems that the caviomorph rodents descended from a colonization event that happened when some of these African rodents probably got stuck on mats of floating vegetation and drifted across the Atlantic into South America. And so they radiated into all these forms of, in some cases, very big rodents. Yeah, the largest rodents that we know of that ever have existed and alive today, for that matter, are caviomorph rodents. And they also made it up into North America during the Great American Biotic Interchange. And today we still have one representative of this colonization event, and that is the North American porcupine. Yeah, the North American porcupine is an immigrant or descendants of an immigrant from the south. And I think in a lot of zoos you can actually see South American porcupines that are alive today, the prehensile-tailed porcupines, which are also tree-dwelling but look pretty different. Yeah, they have this long naked tail that they are able to grasp branches, which is pretty interesting. But
I like
yeah.
to think of them as long-tailed pigs covered in dust bunnies.
Yeah, that's not a bad description. Definitely. All right, and also pictured on the figure here, we also see an example of a freshwater fish group that moved northward. So they pictured a freshwater angelfish here over Central America, and they belong to a group of fish called the cichlids, which were originally confined to South America before moving north, apparently. In terms of birds, other than the terror birds, because the fossil record of birds is so sparse, we don't have a very good record of exactly what the interchanges are going on here, and that's why we're talking so much about mammals here. But from partially from molecular clocks and also from just inferring distributions from living forms, we can infer that there were some other colonizations going on with birds as well. So here they pictured parrots kind of moving northward, and that does seem to be the case. Today, most of the parrots we see in North America are actually introduced species. Actually, in historical times, there actually have been a couple of parrot species that lived natively north of Mexico, and things like the Carolina parakeet, which was unfortunately later driven to extinction, and the thick-billed parrot, which today is mostly confined to regions south of the Mexican-American border. But they are descendants of South American parrots that came up into the north. All right, so those are the southern immigrants, and let's see what moved south from the north. So again, lots of different mammal groups did that. For example, proboscideans, elephants and their relatives, stem elephants in this case, moved down south, and now the elephants, they ultimately originated from Africa. They belong to a group of mammals called the Aphrotheres, which originated in Africa. But the elephants were a very successful group, and so they quickly spread all over the world, including Eurasia and North America. And so we had mastodons and mammoths in these land masses. And as soon as maybe not as soon as, but when the land masses formed that connected North and South America, the elephants also moved south as well. Now, today there aren't any proboscideans in South America because they died out during the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions, but they were doing it pretty well for a while there. You also had a variety of different hoofed mammal groups. Things like horses came down into South America from North America. Deer came down. Camels and their relatives came down. Well, specifically things like the ancestors of the llama and the vicuña alive today. And in fact, today, kind of ironically, in North America, there aren't any kind of camel relatives anymore, but we do have them still in the Andean regions of South America. And let's see, other hoofed mammals include things like tapirs and also peccaries as well. And then there were the carnivorous mammal groups. Things like the canids, foxes and wolves and their relatives, skunks and raccoons, and also weasels and their relatives, and of course the cats also moved down into South America as well. So today, some of the top predators in South America are cats, so jaguars and mountain lions. And back then, before the Pleistocene megafaunal extinction, there were also the saber-toothed cats down there as well. So they definitely would have been quite a force that shaped the ecosystems when they arrived. Um, and among the rodents and rabbits, there were a number of groups that moved down south. So the rabbits themselves, you had squirrels that moved down south, and a big radiation of mouse-like rodents called sigmodontines. They became extremely diverse down in South America, and still are very diverse today. The mammals that moved down south, they also quite carved out a lot of niches for themselves. Um, and so, yeah, you can see that this was this huge kind of dramatic turnover in what animals could be found where, and there must have been some ecological effects of this, and there has been a lot of speculation about this. Basically, what happened, what kind of ecological effects happened when you got this great interchange. And so, a kind of very classic hypothesis related to this is basically that, when the predatory mammals of the north moved down into South America, they basically outcompeted all the native South American predators that were already there. Because prior to this great American biotic interchange, the top predators of South America were things like the terror birds and the stem marsupial sparacidonts, and for a while there were also these large stem crocodilians as well, that were around during the Miocene. But a lot of those predators, they seem to have disappeared or declined in the wake of this great American biotic interchange. And so, kind of a very classic idea is that, they were outcompeted by these northern predators coming down from the north. Particularly the carnivorans, the main group of large prey hunting mammals that are alive today. Uh, well, it does seem plausible on its face that this could have happened, right? Especially since we know in a lot of cases, things like flightless birds and marsupials today seem to be very vulnerable to kind of when we introduce kind of placental predators into their native ranges. And quickly decline due to predation or competition. But it doesn't seem like things are so clear cut. I mean, for one thing, it's very difficult to test kind of hypotheses of ecological interactions in the fossil record. Like, it is very difficult to demonstrate from the fossil record that this group declined specifically because this other group was competing with it for the same resources or preying on it or whatever. And you might be able to imagine why. Like, even if you see a trend in the fossil record, like, this group declines in diversity after this group arrives, you don't know if the other group caused it, right? As they say, correlation is not causation. It may be that the first group was already declining for other reasons, and then the other group just happened to move into this kind of emptying niche or something like that. And some studies that have been done, particularly looking more at the sparacidonts, do seem to conclude that this might have been the case, that it wasn't that carnivorans were outcompeting sparacidonts, but sparacidonts might have already been on the decline for other unrelated reasons, and the carnivorans just kind of moved in on those niches. And as far as terror birds are concerned, we haven't had too many detailed studies done on like the timing and the kind of diversity effects going on here. But we do know that terror birds did make it northward for a little bit. As mentioned before, Titanus, this giant terror bird, has been found in the Pliocene sediments of southern United States, and so it stuck around there for a while, living alongside carnivorans. Seemingly doing all right. Probably, this kind of competition from carnivorans might not have been the whole story as to the decline of the South American predators. It could have been part of it, sure, but it doesn't seem to be such a clear-cut case as is sometimes portrayed. I'm sure, a lot of us who watched Walking with Beasts or Prehistoric Park growing up, we definitely got used to seeing this hypothesis portrayed in nature documentaries or mockumentaries, as it were, where they showed like things like the saber-toothed cats competing with the terror birds and kind of driving them to decline. But yeah, in reality, the evidence for this is quite difficult to tease out, and is somewhat ambiguous. So yeah, that's kind of the story there. Now, despite that, we do know that the giant terror birds do seem to have disappeared at the end of the Pliocene, as far as we know. As mentioned before, it seems that in South America, at least, some of the smaller species of terror birds might have still been around until the Pleistocene. But after that, it seems that the reign of the terror birds was over. All right. Do you have anything to add to this really big kind of topic?
Well, I mean, that was certainly a fantastic overview of this remarkable event in Earth's history. I actually didn't know that there was a controversy about the timing and like the actual like composition of the land masses
Oh, yeah.
regarding. I thought this was kind of an open and shut case, but wow, um, yeah, that's really fascinating. Um, I guess the only thing I can add, I guess a little bit of extra clarification.
Sure.
The Great American Biotic Interchange was not necessarily completely wholesale. That animals moved all the way up or all the way
Yeah.
south. I mean, there were a lot of groups. For example, they stayed around in Middle America, like
Right.
the uh, the New World monkeys,
That's right.
and there were a lot of groups that just hung out and went to the Caribbean.
Right.
And yeah, it really depended on like what niche the animal was used to, and then sort of like what sort of environment it preferred to live in, or at least it had evolved to live in.
Right.
And so like that kind of dictated, well, no, not dictated, it's not the right word. It sort of uh,
Mm,
impacted how far they traveled up north.
right.
Um,
Yeah. Or south.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And yes, the kind of the timing of the formation of the Isthmus of Panama, that's a pretty recent debate. I think the original paper that proposed that the Isthmus might have formed earlier came out in 2015 or so. So yeah,
Oh wow.
yeah, it's very recent, and there have been a few kind of back and forth since then. But yeah, I think it's definitely going to be something that's probably going to take a while before it's settled.
There's a lot of things in natural history research that I haven't kept up with, and I guess this is certainly one of them that I must have missed when it came out.
Right.
I look forward to hearing where this conversation is going to go.
Oh, sure, of course. Yeah, yeah. I mean, when we're dealing as with topics as big as this, no one person can keep up with all of it. So, yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's always lots more to learn and discover.
Oh yeah.
All right. So let's go on to the next slide. So we have a kind of that's kind of concludes our discussion of terror birds. I think we already kind of spent a lot more time on them than we have for all the other bird groups. So I think that's fair. So let's look at a few of the other maybe more obscure groups of cariamiforms that have been found in the fossil record. So one example here is Bathornis from the Paleogene, the Eocene to Oligocene of North America. Um, and Bathornis has been named, or rather, many species of Bathornis have been named, but it's kind of a taxonomic mess, I guess. Like there's a lot of kind of uncertainty about whether all of these things should really be classified in the same genus, and whether or not some of these are actually the same species. But it's really a big mess. But we do have a few pretty good specimens, and the most completely known species is the one pictured here, is a Bathornis scrollator. Which was originally described as a New World vulture, actually, and it does have a few features that are similar to New World vultures, so I can see why that happened. You might have seen it perhaps in some old books labeled as a Neocathartes, but yeah, now it is currently considered a species of Bathornis, and it is known from a partial skeleton including a nearly complete skull, so that's pretty nice. And yeah, it's Bathornis overall, the various species, at least the ones that we're pretty sure belong to Bathornis, they were slightly larger than living Seriemas. So think about in the range of a meter tall or so maybe, and they were also flightless, so that's quite interesting. So yeah, it seems to have been that these were kind of mid-sized predators in the Paleogene of North America, and flightless, ground-running birds that were occupying this niche, and that is quite interesting because at this time there were carnivorous mammals in North America. Yeah, Bathornis seems to be an example of a flightless carnivorous bird that was able to survive alongside mammalian carnivores. It also shows that these kinds of ecological relationships that we might assume are common patterns, are not necessarily always so clear cut. Quite an interesting creature, seemingly. They didn't get as large as terror birds did, but they do seem to have played a somewhat similar role in North America before terror birds actually made it up into North America. So that's pretty interesting. Do you have anything to add about this?
Not really, no.
Yeah, I know these are pretty obscure groups we're gonna be going through here, so probably not a lot of pop culture presence.
Which is a shame because I mean, they certainly all have their own fascinating histories, and I certainly could afford to learn a little bit more about them myself.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Even in terms of research wise, a lot of these groups are quite understudied. So even though even those of us who study fossil birds could do with learning more about them. Now, on the next slide, we also have another mostly Paleogene group, although they seem to have made it into the Miocene, called the idiornithids. This group was, as far as we know, seemingly restricted to Europe, and they were not flightless, as far as we could tell. They seem to have still been able to fly, and overall, they seem to have been largely similar to living Seriemas in terms of their size. So, yeah, around the same size as modern Seriemas, or even smaller than that, and probably doing quite similar things. They do have a few differences from modern Seriemas. For example, they had a larger hallux, so maybe they were spending a little bit more time in trees, but overall they do still seem to have been largely terrestrial. So yeah, probably doing very similar things to modern Seriemas, but on a very different continent. So those are the idiornithids. Many species of idiornithids have been named, and a lot of them are known from many bones. But the thing is that a lot of those bones are often isolated bones, so we don't see them preserved in connection with each other. So we don't get a lot of complete skeletons of these guys, even though they are known from many abundant specimens. Probably the most completely known specimen is the one pictured here. This is one from the Messel. Again, we're seeing the Messel again from the Eocene of Germany. And that is a Deinamopterus tuberculatus. And it is known from a nearly complete skeleton, although the bones themselves are quite crushed and flattened, so they're not that well preserved in themselves. But it does give us a sense of the proportions of this bird. And if, in case you're wondering, the genus Idiornis, which most members of this group belong to, it turns out that it should be considered the same genus as Deinamopterus, and so all the species of Idiornis have been moved into the genus Deinamopterus. So if you ever come across the genus Idiornis in the literature, that's what it's referring to. They're all now Deinamopterus. All right, so that's actually about it for groups of fossil cariamiforms that we're pretty confident are cariamiforms. But this episode is not over yet, because there actually is a great diversity of fossil birds that have been considered similar to cariamiforms, but have rather unresolved affinities. Do you have anything to add before we go on to those?
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing about them for sure.
Alrighty, so let's go to the next slide and start meeting some of these mystery birds. So the thing is, there have been a handful of studies, phylogenetic analyses, done trying to place a lot of these Seriema-like birds in the bird family tree. But the problem is that because until recently we didn't really know where Seriemas belonged, right? We thought they were groupiforms. And so a lot of these early studies that studied the phylogeny, or tried to study the phylogeny of cariamiforms, they assumed that Seriemas were groupiforms, and so they only included in their sampling of species other what were considered at the time other types of groupiforms. The species that you choose to include in a phylogenetic analysis can make a big difference as to the results of your phylogenetic analysis. And if you don't actually include the species that actually are closely related to a group in the analysis, then you can't actually correctly place the group in the analysis, right? It's just not possible.
Funny how that works.
Right. So Yeah, so the thing is, a lot of these groups might have been included in phylogenetic analyses in the past, and they were found to be closely related to Seriemas. But because the only other birds in the dataset were, gruiforms, or groups that were thought to be gruiforms, we have to hold these results with some skepticism, because it is quite probable that there are other groups out there that are more closely related to these fossil birds that simply were not considered to be included in the analysis to begin with. And so a lot of these groups are still of rather uncertain affinities, in large part because of this. That no one has really run a really kind of comprehensive enough phylogenetic analysis, including all the possible groups that they could belong to, as well as a big sampling of these fossil Seriema-like birds. And so that is definitely a study that still remains to be done. But for now, we can still, cover them in our series here. So first off, we have a genus called Strigogyps that is known from several species from the Paleogene of Europe, definitely from the Eocene, and there are some specimens that might come from the Oligocene. The dating is difficult to tell on those. And Strigogyps appears to have been another possibly flightless bird, or at least had reduced flight capabilities because its forelimbs were relatively short compared to its body. And they were about the size of a large chicken, I guess. So yeah, so around the size of a modern Seriema. The hind limbs were quite robust. Now the feet were not as long as they are in modern Seriemas, but the feet were quite strong with big claws on them. So perhaps they were using the feet for some purpose or another, maybe for grasping food, for example. Something pretty curious is that there is one specimen, in fact, the one pictured here, that preserves gut contents, and these gut contents are vegetation. Yeah, so these appear to have been at least partially plant-eating birds, and unfortunately, we don't have a well-preserved skull from Strigogyps yet. So yeah, it's hard to tell, hard to corroborate, this from skull anatomy or beak anatomy. But yeah, it seems that these were plant-eating birds, which would be pretty unusual for this group. But again, Seriemas, they do eat some plant material, so maybe it's not as weird as it might seem at first glance. But yeah, well, the phylogenetic affinities of this genus are still a little bit suspect. They were traditionally thought closely related to terror birds specifically, but probably a lot of those features that were kind of considered evidence for this relationship are the result of convergent evolution towards a flightlessness. And in fact, it doesn't have some of the features that are shared between Phorusrhacids and Seriemas, and so it might actually belong outside of the clade containing those two. So yeah, I guess hopefully with more specimens and more complete specimens and more comprehensive analyses, we can get a better sense of what this kind of curious genus of birds really was. This genus has also had a rather complicated taxonomic history as well, like even beyond just the mysteries of phylogenetic position, because there was one particular specimen where the basically the wing and the foot were named different things. Like, yeah, and so the wing was thought to have belonged to a ground hornbill, and the foot was thought to have belonged to a New World vulture. And then it was later discovered, oh, this is actually the same individual bird, and it turns out that it's probably the same genus as this other thing that was named much earlier called Strigogyps. So we have to rename it as Strigogyps. And so yeah, there's some fun kind of taxonomic stories going on there. But yeah, definitely quite an unusual bird, and I definitely hope that we can learn more about it in the near future.
Definitely.
All right, let's go on to the next mystery bird. So this is another bird that is known from the Messel. So Strigogyps is known from several sites in Europe, including the Messel, and so Salmila, pictured here, is only known from the Messel. It is a fairly small bird. Like it's smaller than a chicken, like say maybe the size of, I don't know, a quail maybe. And it is known from a couple of pretty complete skeletons. You can see here that this is an essentially complete skeleton, and even has the feathers kind of preserved around it, including some very long tail feathers, which are pretty curious. Um, Now, the hind limbs are much shorter than they are in Seriemas, but it does seem to have been a largely kind of ground-dwelling bird. Um, and it has similarities to Seriemas, but it also has similarities with a group of gruiforms called the trumpeters. If you don't remember the trumpeters, you can go back to our gruiform episode where we talk about them. Um, so yeah, of course we back when we thought Seriemas were gruiforms, this wasn't so surprising because they were like, oh, okay, well, it's similar to two different groups of gruiforms, so this is a gruiform, and that's cool and all that. But of course, we now know that Seriemas and trumpeters are not closely related at all. So what is Salmila? Well, we don't really know. I will say that the long tail feathers are more like Seriemas than they are like most gruiforms. And there actually was a recent phylogenetic analysis that sampled pretty broadly across living birds that ended up placing Salmila within Telleraves. So this group of core land birds, including the Seriemas. But the thing about that analysis was that it was not focused on Telleravi, so it didn't include a lot of different species of Telleravians. It was more interested in gruiforms, and also shorebirds as well. So because that study didn't include a lot of Telleravians, it didn't really have much to say about where within Telleraves Salmilla belonged to. And so I think tentatively, based on that study, we could maybe say that Salmilla is more likely to be a Telleravian than a gruiform. But what kind of Telleravian was it? Nah, we don't know. We're gonna need another study for that. All right. Should we go on to the next one?
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So this is another genus known from several species from Europe and also from the Paleogene. And in some ways, it's actually pretty similar to Salmilla. The hind limbs are also much shorter than in Seriemas. Um, the wing bones appear to have larger muscle attachments, so it might have been a stronger flyer than living Seriemas. And Elaphrocnemus also appears to have been smaller than living Seriemas. It was also like the size of some of the smaller galliforms, so like quail-sized or so. And it is pretty well represented in terms of its skeleton. We have many of the major limb bones preserved. We even have a pretty complete skull preserved, and it does have some similarities with Seriemas, but it also has similarities with, of all things, the hoatzin. So yeah, we've talked about the hoatzin before. So it's this really weird South American bird that eats leaves, and it is like, of all living birds, it is hands down the most frustrating bird in the world to bird phylogeneticists, because even despite all of the genetic studies that we have, including the hoatzin, we still have not found any consistent position in the bird family tree where it belongs to. So we still don't know what the closest living relatives of the hoatzin are. Um, and yeah, well, what is kind of interesting is that there has been one hypothesis that has suggested that Seriemas are closely related to the hoatzin. Interestingly enough, yeah. Now
Why not?
yeah, that idea was never super popular, but it was proposed by quite a well-respected fossil bird paleontologist, Stores Olsen, who passed away earlier this year, in fact. But yeah, it is true that there are some curious similarities between Seriemas and hoatzins, um, and yeah, Elaphrocnemus, it does have some very odd resemblances to hoatzins, like the upper arm bone, labeled letter C here. The upper arm bone is very hoatzin like. Now I haven't put a picture of a hoatzin bone here to compare, but I can tell you, having studied hoatzin forelimb bones, that this is very hoatzin like, and so yeah, what's going on here? Well, hard to say really. Again, we don't have a comprehensive enough phylogenetic analysis that can really place Elaphrocnemus properly in context of like kind of our modern understanding of bird phylogeny. You know, I guess it wouldn't surprise me greatly if this was actually a stem hoatzin, um, because yeah, it does have a lot of odd, a lot of notable differences from Seriemas. Like it doesn't have a lot of the features that we mentioned were characteristic of cariamiforms early in this episode. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised, I guess, if this turned out to be a stem hoatzin, but it would be very interesting. Um, and there is one kind of recent genetic analysis that placed the hoatzin kind of closely related to Teleraves. Now, the hoatzin definitely is not a member of Teleraves as far as we can tell, but there is one hypothesis that places it as the closest living relative to Teleravians. So if that's the case, then maybe a lot of the hoatzin and Seriema similarities to each other are actually ancestral characters of Teleraves, and or at least a clade containing both hoatzins and Teleraves. So maybe that's what's going on. Well, we don't know. We don't know. We need more studies, but as is often the case. But yeah, in the meantime, this is a pretty interesting little bird. What do you think?
Definitely. I mean, the birds you've been sharing so far, certainly a lot of good opportunities for some PhD projects down the line for future students or something.
Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, if you want a PhD project, try figuring out what all these different birds are. That would be great, and probably several PhD projects, in fact. Okay, let's go on to the next one. This is a Paracrax from the Oligocene of North America, and also known from several species. And Paracrax were these huge birds. So if, and that's a big if, as we'll get to, if they had similar proportions to modern Seriemas, they would have been at least 2 meters tall. Um, so yeah, these were
Wow.
gigantic birds. And traditionally, they were thought to be closely related to another group of large North American Paleogene birds, namely Bathornis. And in fact, even now, you'll see a lot of popular sources say, "Oh yeah, Paracrax is this close relative of Bathornis," but uh, this has actually not been supported by any phylogenetic analyses. Now, like I mentioned, like most of the phylogenetic analyses that have included all these birds are kind of flawed in their own ways, right? But nonetheless, this does seem to suggest that there isn't a very strong reason to consider Paracrax a close relative of Bathornis. Um, and in fact, there it might not even have been a cariamiform, which is also true of many of the other birds we've been talking about. But I think it's especially true of Paracrax. There really aren't a lot of features that it has that clearly indicate cariamiform affinities. And similar to Elaphrocnemus, the humerus, the upper arm bone, which is labeled letter G here, is also quite Hoatzin-like. Um, and it has another very curiously Hoatzin-like feature, and that is its sternum. So its sternum is labeled letter H here, so the breastbone. So on the left, you're viewing it basically from the bottom up, so the bottom of the sternum will be facing in the same direction as the belly of the bird. And on the right, you're seeing the sternum from the side, and you can see that whereas in most birds you would see this big keel kind of projecting out the bottom of the sternum, in Paracrax you can see this got a weird dip in the middle. Yeah, what's going on with that? So this definitely isn't a feature that is often seen in birds, but it is seen in the Hoatzin. Yeah, and we talked about this when we talked about the Hoatzin. And in fact, we talked about the Hoatzin in the gruiform episode, even though it's not a gruiform, for reasons I explained in that episode. Um, yeah, so if you want to go and refresh your memory on kind of birds that have traditionally been thought to be closely related to Seriemas, go back to the gruiform episode. Um, but in any case, we talked about how the Hoatzin has a very curious kind of digestive system, where it has a very expanded kind of front region of its digestive tract, and it has this basically has this fermentation chamber to kind of digest all the leafy greens that it eats, because vegetation tends to be very hard to digest, and because of this, because it needs to make room for this kind of expanded digestive tract. The sternal keel of the Hoatzin has kind of been shoved backwards, and so it has this kind of gap in the sternum to make room for the digestive system. And we're seeing a kind of quite similar anatomy here in the sternum of Paracrax. And so, yeah, maybe Paracrax was this giant herbivorous bird that was eating leaves like a hoatzin, maybe even closely related to hoatzins itself. Well, we don't know. We have no idea, but uh, it's a possibility. It doesn't seem, any more unlikely than the possibility that it is a cariamiform. Um, so yeah, I really look forward to hopefully someone eventually finding a more complete skeleton of Paracrax someday, so we can maybe get a better sense of what it was. But yeah, very odd bird, definitely, and would have been quite a sight to see considering it was probably a really big creature.
Kind of reminds me of Gastornis a little bit in
Yeah,
that, if that's the case, a big herbivorous bird hanging around in a world of mammals.
yeah.
Not too far fetched, but it would be no less amazing.
Definitely, yeah. Agreed. All right, now on the next slide, I think this is the final kind of mystery bird I have decided to cover here. So this is a Brontornis, which is also another very large bird, in fact, an even larger bird than Paracrax. So Brontornis is known from fossils from the Miocene of South America, and is primarily known from hind limb bones, as is pictured on the diagram here. There are a few kind of vertebrae and fragments of the skull and a lower jaw that might belong to it, but of course, without a complete skeleton, it's hard to tell. But you know, it was probably among the largest known birds, over 300 kilograms. So yeah, probably only exceeded in size by the biggest dromornithids of Australia, and the biggest elephant birds of Madagascar. But yeah, otherwise one of the largest known birds for sure. Um, and quite curiously, it was traditionally thought to have been a terror bird, but some phylogenetic analyses have suggested that this is not the case, and furthermore, it also has some features that are indicative not of a kind of terror bird like kind of predatory lifestyle, um, but perhaps more of a herbivorous one as well, because the claws on its feet were not the sharp talons that terror birds and other mostly raptorial birds have. They were instead kind of more hoof-like and short and broad, and these are more characteristic of large flightless birds that we know are herbivorous. And if that really deep kind of lower jaw belongs to it, then that would also be more consistent with a herbivorous kind of diet. And so, what was it? Well, again, it has traditionally been considered a cariamiform, and there are even some pretty recent studies, some phylogenetic analyses, have argued, or at least found, that it is probably one. But there have also been other paleontologists who have argued quite strongly that no, this is not a cariamiform at all, but probably more likely some kind of Galoenceran, so a member of the chicken and duck group, that similar to the dromornithids and Gastornis became this big flightless herbivore, perhaps independently. And so, yeah, this is still an open question, I guess. And because the remains that we have are so fragmentary, I think it will be very hard for us to know for sure unless we get more complete specimens. And certainly because so many of these bones are hind limb bones, it's easy to see probably why its phylogenetic position is so uncertain, because you would expect, all these big flightless birds, no matter what they are, to have some similar adaptations for kind of weight bearing, right? And so, yeah, it probably is the case that just having these hind limb bones alone makes it very tricky for us to tell exactly what this bird was. But yeah, it would be very interesting if there was this huge flightless herbivorous bird that was not closely related to the terror birds, but living alongside them in a very kind of different kind of ecological niche. All
Yeah, kind
right.
of like a age of reptiles beginning again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, where the some of the big herbivores and the big carnivores were both dinosaurs, even though there were also big herbivorous mammals then as well. Um, all right. So I think that's the last of the mystery birds I have to cover. Again, if anybody's looking for a PhD project in bird paleontology, I think any of these birds would be very good study subjects. And let's go on to the next slide and kind of do a summary of what we've seen today. So again, because most of the kind of anatomical phylogenetic analyses looking at cariamiforms have not really taken into account what we now know about their phylogenetic position, namely that they belong to teleraves and are closely related to things like falcons and parrots. So kind of our understanding of their overall phylogeny is similarly pretty unresolved. But nonetheless, as we mentioned earlier, the terror birds and Seriemas do share some notable kind of anatomical features, and so it doesn't seem unlikely that within the cariamiforms that these two might be especially close to each other, and of course they are both found in South America as well. Um, and then with the Bathornis and idiornithids, they do seem to have a lot of the hallmark features of cariamiforms, but their relationship to the terror birds and the Seriemas, it's still something that requires more study. And of course, we saw a whole range of mystery birds later in the episode. That some of them, at least some of them, might be cariamiforms as well, but at least others, I think there's a pretty good chance that they are not. So yeah, we'll see how this develops in the future. But in any case, this certainly is a very dramatic radiation of birds that, even though are only known by 2 living species today, have had a much broader distribution in the ancient past and even occupied some really kind of impressive niches like apex predators. And so, yeah, they are quite an impressive group of birds, despite their much diminished diversity, I think. And as we mentioned previously, probably this is another group of birds that experienced dramatic kind of range contractions due to climate changes throughout the Cenozoic. But despite that, they have still done pretty well for themselves, I think. Do you have anything more to add before we wrap up?
No, but I definitely agree. It's a fascinating group, and as much as it is kind of hilarious to think about like this huge radiation being represented today by like these two rather diminutive species,
Right.
it's also like super special because you can look at these two birds and know this history, and they become 10 times more special than they already are.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of, evolutionary distinctiveness, as we say. Uh, yeah, like they're so different from all their living relatives, and they had such a diverse and dramatic evolutionary legacy behind them. It's really cool. They are really cool birds. Um, all right, now next time on Dinosaurs, the second chapter, as we'll see in the preview, um, we're going to continue looking at australavians, and specifically because the passeriforms are such a huge group of birds, I decided to leave them for their own episode. And so instead, we'll cover the other two australavian groups. We'll cover the falcons and the parrots. These other unlikely cousins of each other, but both of them are certainly very impressive groups in their own ways. We're going to look at the fastest animal alive. We're going to look at some of the most intelligent animals alive today, and look a little bit at their kind of fossil histories as well. So I think both of these groups, I think, are quite popular groups of birds for their own reasons and for very good reasons. Yeah, I think we'll have fun with them.
For sure.
Alrighty, so with that, I'd like to thank our friends Henry and Alicia for their usual contributions to our episodes, the music and the color scheme for my Albersaur avatar. And if you enjoyed this episode, you can follow us on Twitter for updates. We'll tweet whenever we release new episodes. You can also subscribe to us on our YouTube page, where you're probably listening or watching right now. Check us out. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave a comment on the video. We do enjoy receiving those. Or if you don't want to leave a comment in public, you can always email us at timeandclades@gmail.com. And as always, we will include links to the references I used for this episode in the description. Okay, so next week, it'll be the start of July. Oh my goodness. Um, we're going to do another news episode next week, I believe. But after that, we are going to conclude Jones' series, Humanity, a Prologue. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's right. We've basically finished like the early prehistory of human species. Now we're going to kind of take a step back and look at the state of affairs today and what the future might hold for the hominins and everything that that pertains to. So I'm definitely
Wow.
looking forward to that. Definitely a it's going to be an interesting experience seeing the conclusion of this series, and I hope you will all join us for that.
Yeah, definitely. Looking forward to that for sure. Alrighty then. Well, with that, hope everyone stays safe and see you next week and take care.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us.